In 1929, the global capitalist economy experienced an unprecedented meltdown. The crash of the New York Stock Exchange signaled the beginning of a broad, severe world economic depression. Banks and businesses shuttered en masse. Unemployment reached stratospheric proportions. From the Americas to Europe to Japan, the economic devastation was profound and would quickly have major political consequences. In the United States, the 1932 presidential election would see Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt win a crushing landslide over Republican President Herbert Hoover. Roosevelt campaigned on a New Deal for the American people, a program of economic relief for the poor and unemployed, and sweeping reforms on the financial system. The New Deal represented a major shift in the social mood that wouldn't be limited to just the USA. The Great Depression was sapping faith in the old system of unconstrained, laissez-faire capitalism. Increasingly, a consensus was forming among the ruling classes of capitalist countries that reform was direly necessary, or the whole system could come tumbling down. Around the same time, an English economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes published his magnum opus, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, in 1936. Keynes forwarded a new theory of economic crises under capitalism. For Keynes, crises were caused by deficient aggregate demand, the total spending within the economy. Insufficient aggregate demand produced endemic unemployment, Keynes argued, and hence governments should implement policies to prop up aggregate demand. Keynes's ideas would soon form the basis for a new political economy of capitalism. The old political economy of capitalism had been neoclassical economics, which argued for strict laissez-faire capitalism without state interference. The new political economy would lend a justification for a compact between labor and capital. To maintain aggregate demand, governments would pursue policies to prop up spending. In practice, this meant a regime of strong labor unions, expansive social programs for the working class, and higher rates of capital investment. These policies would boost workers' incomes and maintain full employment, which would in turn maintain aggregate demand and thus prevent economic crises. Or so the thinking went. In the Western economies under the Keynesian regime, the post-war era would be something of a golden age for the working class. Real wages rose vigorously, unions became very powerful, and the welfare state provided a strong social safety net. For free market liberals, the situation was very alarming. In the capitalist world, the labor movement was at unprecedented strength, and genuine socialist mass parties, and even some communist parties, were in the parliaments of many quote-unquote liberal democratic capitalist countries. Even in the US, where the socialist movement was weak and working class gains were not as deep as in Europe, the post-war era saw the most dramatic increase in living standards in American history. And meanwhile, in the East, the communist bloc presented an alternative system. The global prestige of the USSR reached a peak in the 1950s and 60s. The Soviet Union had defeated the Nazis and undergone extremely rapid industrialization, and were continuing to close the gap with the West. Global capitalism was very much on the defensive, facing down powerful labor and socialist movements internally, and a massive external challenge from the East. In this political climate, the free market fundamentalists were pushed to the fringes. It seemed that the old style of laissez-faire capitalism was gone forever. In a letter in 1954, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower wrote, "Should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There is a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Among them are a few other Texas oil millionaires and an occasional politician or businessman from other areas. Their number is negligible, and they are stupid." 10 years later, in 1964, it became ever clearer that Eisenhower had underestimated the free market fundamentalists. That year, the Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater won the Republican nomination for the American presidential election. Goldwater ran on what was then considered a far-right platform, combining an extreme anti-communist foreign policy with a desire to dismantle the New Deal regime. Goldwater was deeply unpopular and lost the election to Lyndon Johnson in a landslide. But make no mistake, he was a harbinger of things to come. In October, just before the presidential election, a B-list Hollywood actor named Ronald Reagan spoke out in support of Goldwater, in a speech which essentially launched Reagan's political career. The free market fundamentalists whom Eisenhower had dismissed as irrelevant were making major strides, and a decade later, the tide would turn radically in their favor. In the 1970s, the capitalist world experienced yet another crisis. The post-war boom came to an end, and economic troubles began to mount. Major capitalist economies experienced stagflation, rising unemployment and inflation simultaneously. This was nothing short of a full-fledged crisis for the post-war Keynesian order. Stagflation was very economically destructive, and Keynesians had no explanation or solution. Stagflation was thought to be impossible. Unemployment and inflation were thought to always have an inverted relationship, the so-called Phillips curve. The crisis galvanized the free market fundamentalists, who blamed Keynesian policy for stagflation, and argued for a return to neoclassical doctrine as the solution to the crisis. This was the rise of neoliberalism. The first testing ground for neoliberalism was in Chile. In 1973, a military coup, backed by the US, was launched against Chile's elected socialist president, Salvador Allende. General Augusto Pinochet seized power and brought in neoliberal economic advisors to direct his economic program. Under Pinochet, Chile became a model for neoliberalism. The economic crisis was addressed through brutally crushing organized labor and mass privatization and deregulation of the economy to restore the profitability of capital at the expense of the working class. Then, in 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister of the UK. And in 1980, Ronald Reagan decisively won the presidency in the US. Reagan and Thatcher did not trigger the neoliberal turn, but they were its most visible representatives. All across the capitalist world, the ruling classes pivoted toward a neoliberal ideology, and socialism and social democracy were in retreat. The question then arises, how did neoliberalism triumph? What caused the economic crisis of the 1970s? And why did neoliberalism emerge victorious? First, let's look at things at an ideological and theoretical level. Within economics, you can conceptualize economic schools as falling on a political spectrum, from far right to far left. The far right is represented by the Austrian school, which is closely associated with right-wing libertarianism and so-called anarcho-capitalism. And next, there's neoclassical economics, which is less extreme than the Austrian school, but still assumes a stridently pro-market stance, and has been significantly influenced by Austrian theorists. Then there's the neoclassical synthesis and the new Keynesians. These are the centrists, so to speak, of economics. They combine a neoclassical theory with Keynesian macroeconomics. This gets a little convoluted because there was an original neoclassical synthesis in the post-war era, and now there's a new neoclassical synthesis, but the commonality is that they both combine neoclassical and Keynesian economics. Next, there's post-Keynesianism, and these are Keynesians who reject neoclassical economics completely. They are, in a sense, more pure Keynesians, though many of their ideas aren't found in Keynes himself. Then there's Marxist economics, which is based on the labor theory of value. These schools clearly correspond to different political movements and different class interests. I believe one should conceptualize Austrian neoclassical, the neoclassical synthesis, and post-Keynesian economics as all being different forms of bourgeois economics, which is to say economic schools that work in the interests of the capitalist class. Austrian and neoclassical economics are reactionary and conservative bourgeois economics. The neoclassical synthesis is centrist bourgeois economics, and post-Keynesianism is progressive bourgeois economics. Austrian and neoclassical economics are radically pro-capitalism and pro-market. They argue that the free market generally sorts things out in the end, and so government intervention should be minimal, or even non-existent. Keynesian economics is still pro-capitalism and pro-market, but believes capitalism requires state intervention to survive. Keynesians argue that capitalism, when left to its own devices, periodically produces crises of aggregate demand, and so the state should work to maintain aggregate demand. Strong labor unions, expansive welfare states, and subsidizing capital investment not only help workers, but actually make capitalism healthier in the long run, because they stimulate aggregate demand. Essentially, Keynesians say that we can have our cake and eat it too. We can have high wages, full employment, and healthy profits for capitalists while forever avoiding capitalist crises, so long as we maintain aggregate demand. Marxist economics, however, argues that there's a fundamental class contradiction between labor and capital. Labor is the source of economic value. The appropriation of a surplus labor time is the basis of capitalist profit. As such, the class antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the working class is irreconcilable. Furthermore, capitalism is doomed to recurring economic crises driven by the falling rate of profit. For understanding why neoliberalism triumphed, the most concise answer is basically that Keynesian economics was discredited by the crisis of the 1970s. And Marxist economics was nowhere to be seen, meaning there was no viable left-wing alternative in the public discourse to Keynesianism. When the stagflation crisis arrived, Keynesians offered no explanation, while the neoclassicals did. The neoclassicals argued basically that the organized working class had too much power, and that there was too much restriction on the free market. Milton Friedman famously argued that Keynesian policies produced stagflation by trying to force unemployment below the natural rate, quote-unquote. The arguments of Friedman and his peers were elaborate and opaque, but the basic theme was that the post-war Keynesian regime had to be dismantled. Wages had to be suppressed, which meant crushing the power of organized labor. Taxes on the rich and the private sector would be slashed greatly. Industry would be privatized en masse. Industry would be outsourced to poorer countries with lower labor costs, and full employment would cease being a policy objective. In concrete political economic terms, neoliberalism intensified the rate of exploitation and slowed down rates of capital accumulation. These measures would have the effect of stabilizing the rate of profit and preventing world capitalism from plunging into a depression. What caused the economic crisis of the 1970s? Or in general, what causes economic crises under capitalism? Mainstream bourgeois economics still can't agree upon what caused the 1970s crisis, nor the Great Depression for that matter, nor the Long Depression of the 1870s to 1890s, nor the Great Recession, nor any capitalist crisis. This inability to understand crises is a sign that bourgeois economics is not scientific. For a field to be truly considered scientific, it has to shed light on how the world works, which is the very point of science. Ultimately, to understand capitalist crises, we need the labor theory of value. When starting from the understanding that all economic value comes from labor, we can trace the dynamics of capitalism to predict that crises should periodically arise. Crises under capitalism are crises of profitability. Capitalist profit stems from the appropriation of surplus labor time from the working class. Only labor can create value. Capital doesn't create value. Profit comes from the exploitation of human labor power. Everything workers produce above the value of their wage goes to their employers as profit. However, capitalists are also incentivized by competition to boost output by investing in capital goods, machinery, tools, and raw materials. And if growth in the capital stock outpaces the growth of the labor force, the rate of profit will decline. Capitalist crises are driven by what Marxists call the organic composition of capital, the value of the capital stock relative to the value of labor power in production. After a period of high accumulation, the rising OCC eventually produces a bust. These are capitalist crises. The post-war era was a boom period, and combined with Keynesian policies which further boosted capital accumulation, the rate of profit took a nosedive, culminating in the 1970s crisis. This fatally undermined the Keynesian consensus. Meanwhile, on the left, there was simply no answer being offered to counter the neoclassicals. Keynesian economics was failing, and the left failed to offer another answer. But there was another answer: Marxist economics and economic planning. By moving toward a more socialist economy and placing industry under public control, the crisis could have been addressed in a manner favorable to the working class. But hardly anyone was advocating economic planning as the solution to the crisis. And a major reason was because Marxist economics was insufficiently developed at a theoretical level. The USSR established a centrally planned socialist economy, but wasn't operating off a scientific Marxist political economy. The theoretical foundation of centrally planned socialism was lacking. During the 1920s, it was still an open question as to what economic system the Soviet Union would adopt. Under Lenin, the USSR adopted the new economic policy, which was a mixed economy of capitalism, state capitalism, and socialism. Lenin considered this a temporary policy, but there were many Bolsheviks like Bukharin who supported permanently adopting the mixed economy. There was a vigorous debate as to whether to continue with the NEP or move toward full socialism and economic planning. Under Stalin, the USSR pivoted toward a centrally planned socialist economy in 1928, nationalizing all industry, collectivizing the farms, and gearing economic production toward a general plan. But there was no blueprint. This was a journey into the unknown. Marxism during the 20th century was stuck in a theoretical quagmire. Marxists couldn't construct a scientific political economy because Marxists were still stuck on some basic questions. To summarize, Marxists were confused on the basic nature of economic value. Marx based his political economy on the labor theory of value, the notion that value is determined by socially necessary labor time. The LTV essentially says that the harder things are to make, the more valuable they are. The average amount of labor time required to produce a commodity determines its value. The LTV predicts that market prices are roughly proportional to labor values. The LTV also leads to the logical conclusion that in a socialist economy, the prices of goods and services should be proportional to labor values. Whether in a capitalist or socialist economy, labor is the substance of value, and hence prices should be linked to labor values. But there was a problem. Marx, just as the classical economists before him, believed there was a problem with the simple LTV. To sum it up, Marx and the classical economists believed that profit rates equalized between different sectors in a capitalist economy. Marx went as far as to argue that profit rate equalization was necessary for a capitalist economy to reproduce itself. Marx and the classical economists believed that market prices gravitate toward profit rate equalizing prices, better known as prices of production. When you go deeper into the weeds of political economy, the concept of prices of production can take on a related but somewhat different meaning, so for my purposes I will say classical prices of production, to refer to what Marx and the classical economists originally meant, prices which facilitate profit rate equalization. However, profit rate equalization posed a problem for the LTV. The LTV implies that profit rates should be lower in more capital-intensive industries. This contradicts the notion that profit rates equalize, and this was a problem both David Ricardo and Marx tried to grapple with. This was the transformation problem. and I would argue that this was the fundamental impediment to turning Marxist political economy into a science. And this created a problem for socialist economics. In a socialist economy, should prices be proportional to labor values or to classical prices of production? The solution wouldn't arrive until 1983. That year, the mathematicians Emanuel Farjon and Moshe Machover published Laws of Chaos, where they argued that the transformation problem is based on a faulty premise. Farjon and Machover argue that profit rate equalization is an unrealistic assumption, and that prices are in fact proportionate to labor values in a market economy. This has been confirmed by subsequent empirical studies. Labor values and prices have a close correlation. And no, the correlation isn't spurious despite what bourgeois economists will tell you. This settled the transformation problem and allowed a Marxist political economy to become a true science. Then, in 1993, Paul Cockshott and Alan Cottrell published Towards a New Socialism, proposing a model of central planning based on labor values and utilizing a modern computing technology. And with this, a scientific theoretical foundation for socialist economics was developed. But it was already too late. The Soviet bloc had collapsed, and neoliberalism was ascendant throughout the world. In an essay in 2011, Paul Cockshott wrote, "When I was a student, my economics professor told us that whilst the labor theory of value had been an important historical stage in the development of economics, it was now known to be fatally flawed. 20th century economists such as Straffa and Samuelson had shown that it was unnecessary to accord labor any special place in our understanding of prices. Instead, the structure of prices could be perfectly well understood as the result of the monetary costs faced by firms and the behavior of profit-maximizing entrepreneurs. If there was, in reality, no such thing as labor value, it followed that Marxist theory of exploitation was an invalid incursion of moral prejudices into the positive science of economics." The professor who taught us this, Ian Steedman, was actually quite left-wing, an active member of the Communist Party. This is just an anecdote, but the fact that even a prominent communist intellectual believed that the central component of Marxist theory was scientifically worthless is significant. In retrospect, it gave an indication of how poorly prepared the intellectuals of the communist movement were to be when faced with the very intense ideological attacks on socialism which unfolded in the 1980s and 1990s. In this video, I've focused a lot on the role of economic theory in the rise of neoliberalism, because I think it's essential. The left was entirely unprepared to withstand the theoretical attacks on socialism by liberal economists. Marxist political economy was, as I said, trapped in a theoretical quagmire due to the transformation problem, which prevented Marxists from offering serious rebuttals to liberal critics. Political struggles aren't won just by winning in the marketplace of ideas. However, theory is still essential, because it allows you to construct a coherent, compelling program. Without theory, Marxists couldn't refute the arguments being put forth by neoliberals, and offer an alternative program. Having a scientific political economy wouldn't have assured political victory in of itself, but it would have prevented Marxists from being totally paralyzed. As Cockshott's anecdote demonstrates, the communist movement faltered under the neoliberal onslaught, so much so that even prominent communist intellectuals repudiated the labor theory of value and the possibility of economic planning. In the Soviet bloc, this had the consequence of allowing the pro-market reformers to win the theoretical debate by default. Armed with neoclassical theory, the pro-market reformers argued that partially liberalizing the economy would fix the economic woes of the Soviet bloc and supercharge economic growth. The collapse of the USSR is a subject for a future video, but suffice to say that did not happen. Instead of supercharging the economy, the market reforms led to the whole system unraveling, with dire human consequences for the workers and farmers of the Union. and in the capitalist world, neoliberalism triumphed with ease. The Keynesian consensus was discredited by the 1970s crisis, and there were no other answers coming from the left. Neoliberalism again won the theoretical debate by default. Again, political struggles aren't won just by spreading ideas and putting forward better arguments, but theory is still critical. Without theory, you can't effectively respond to your opponents. Fortunately, we're in a far better position than the Soviets ever were. We now have a solid scientific foundation for socialist economics, and we have a far superior computing technology available to us, allowing for efficient central planning using labor values. With these new tools and advantages, we can reconstitute socialism for the 21st century in due time.